Chapter 8, Part 2. We made it to Micah's on our bikes 10 minutes later after I almost gave Nana a stroke. She apologized about 100 times in the space of 3 minutes, mentioned seeing a psychologist, and promised never to buy cantaloupe again. My father had closed his eyes like he was steadying his insides and reached for me. I tore off with Biddy before there were tears from either one of us. When we reached the Cutter's ratty driftwood sign, the opera music was so loud it rattled the window panes. We peered through. Jimmy, Micah, and Gacy were eating spaghetti. There was one extra plate at the dinner table. It was empty. A small, uneasy knot began to lodge in my stomach. "Biddy," I whispered, inching away. "Don't." But she was already knocking. "Enter!" Gacy yelled. We jumped at the sound of her voice. "Sorry," Biddy squeaked. Biddy held my hand tight as we entered the kitchen and walked to the table. "Nana's looking for Wilbur," I began. Gacy held up her bandaged hand a moment, closed her eyes, and hummed the final notes of the opera, which sang from a small portable CD player on the kitchen counter. I grimaced at the dirty gauze on her hand, at the place where a finger was supposed to sit. Didn't she know anything about clean dressings and infection control? "Ah," she said, tears rolling down her face. That voice. She shook off her emotion and blew her nose on her shirt. "Wilbur's favorite. Now you're looking for him," she said in a brisk voice. "As you can see, he's not here." I eyed the extra dinner plate. She fixed her eyes on me. "I've been having the same dream for days now," she said, changing the subject. "It involves you, Guinevere, and the river. Water is not something to be trifled with. Do you hear me?" "Yes." She turned to Biddy, who was hiding behind me again. "What's the matter with you, Elizabeth? Honestly, don't know how anyone can say the name Biddy with any sort of dignity." And just like that, I hated her again. It was no wonder Wilbur was gone, that no one in this town liked her or wanted to be her friend. "Come here," Gacy said. "Let me see what you're made of." Biddy showed us exactly what she was made of by bravely walking forward until she looked like a tiny shadowed Jonah about to be swallowed up by a giant whale. Gacy squeezed Biddy's shoulders and ran her arms and looked at her right in the eyes. "There's a lot of smart in that pretty head of yours. You make sure you use it." Biddy smiled and shockingly sat down at the table. I wanted to jump and shout, "I object!" Gacy leaned back in her chair and patted her large stomach. Full as a tick." She looked at me. "Hungry?" I said, thinking of Nana's cooking. "Sit," Gacy ordered. Micah patted my back as I sat, his smiling big brown eyes magnified behind his thick glasses. Jimmy nodded his head across the table and opened his mouth full of chewed up spaghetti. "You're disgusting," I said. Gacy came back to the table with 2 plates piled high. "We've already said grace. That sauce is made from our very own garden, isn't it, boys?" "Yep," Micah said. "Garlic, onion, tomatoes, and of course eggplant, squash, zucchini, and spinach," Gacy said. I snapped my fingers, remembering why I was here. "Nana sent me because Wilbur was supposed to help her dig a garden." A shadow crossed Gacy's face. I suddenly noticed how ragged it looked, how red her eyes were, like she'd rubbed them raw. Even the scar down the side of her face looked more purple and pronounced. She leaned forward, changing the subject again. "What I want to know is why Elizabeth never talks." "Shh," Gacy said, glaring at me. "Elizabeth needs to find her own voice. You're quite the number to try to follow, you know, mother and older sister rolled into one." She turned back to Biddy. "What do you have to say, Elizabeth?" Micah burped and Jimmy asked for seconds. Gacy kept her eyes on Biddy, waiting. "I dropped the cantaloupe and made Gwen scream." My face colored at Biddy's betrayal. "You see?" Gacy said, "Now we're getting somewhere." She turned to Micah and Jimmy. "Stop eating like pigs. I didn't raise you to behave like barnyard animals." I looked at Jimmy, wondering again why he never went home and he spent his time with her. "Now, why'd you scream over the cantaloupe, Guinevere?" I looked down at my shoes. "None of your business, it's why," I wanted to say. When I didn't speak, Gacy said, "Saw your mother this morning?" I looked up. "I get such great pleasure bringing her flowers," Gacy said, animated. "Her whole face lights up. There's no guile, no pretense, and we both know she'd tell me if she didn't like 'em." "True." That sounded like Vienna. "I know something of head injuries," Gacy said, her finger absently stroking the long scar on her face. "Jimmy and Micah told you about me, didn't they?" I glanced at them. "Oh, it's not a secret," Gacy said, "though we all have a couple of those in our back pocket. If I were a more perfect woman, I'd be more like your father, who's never kept anything from you." I nodded, but slowly. My father didn't lie to me, but the longer we were in Crow, the more I wondered about what he'd chosen not to tell me. "You don't know the details of the accident, Guinevere, but you want to, don't you?" I kept my eyes on her, wishing I didn't want to know anything about Gacy. "I don't know why Vienna has to live the way she does when I escaped with little more than a scratch." I looked at Gacy's face. Her long scar was more than a scratch. "Life isn't always equitable, is it?" Biddy shook her head. "I didn't have it easy as a child. My parents were not kind people. I was smart and loved learning, but life was difficult. I was never pretty like Vienna," she said. "Not even mercifully plain, not athletic, very clumsy, with big feet. The closest compliment I can ever remember is sturdy. And every day I went to school smelling of pig slop." "Pig slop?" Biddy said. "It's true. I smelled like pig slop, 'cause my stepfather raised pigs, and whoo!" Gacy banged the table with her fist. "Those swine smell so bad. You can't imagine how terrible it is for a young girl to show up at school smelling like pig slop. I endured the insults, the foul smells, the 2 small hand-me-downs, but there was one thing that I desperately longed for." "A shower?" Jimmy asked. "More than a shower," Gacy said. "What I desperately wanted was for someone to need me." She looked longingly at Biddy and then to me. "Guinevere and Biddy, you are so remarkably lucky." Biddy needed me. It's true, I needed her. But I thought of that feeling I got deep down sometimes, a restless longing sort of feeling. An image of Vienna came to my mind, screaming my father's name every time he appeared. The way she asked for him every 5 minutes. She never screamed for me. If need was love, then Vienna didn't love me. Vienna needed only one person, and that was my father. I sometimes thought that this need is what kept him tethered to her, even when she was awful. "I didn't have a family like yours," Gacy said, as if mine was the epitome of bliss. "But I did eventually find true friends. Your parents and Myron. Oh, what a grand thing that was." She blinked rapidly, as if pushing forward a memory. "I would have done anything for them. But our last real adventure was something we shouldn't have done. And that's how the accident happened. Vienna, Jed, Myron and I put my sled on the biggest hill in town. I felt myself going into shock, and my mouth dropped open. "Didn't you know?" Gacy asked. I sat frozen solid to my chair. They were there? Why had my father never told me this story? We had been forbidden to even try it. "Try it?" I managed. "To sled down that spectacular hill. You know, the one right on the side of town as you enter Crow, next to Dingle?" Gacy laughed far away in her recollection. "We were attempting the biggest dare in Crow, sledding down the hill right across the frozen water to the other side of the river. We made it too, several times that winter. What a ride! But the last time, well, it was nearly spring. The ice was melting, and we crashed right through." Her head split in two, Jimmy said. She died, Micah added. I'm quite certain my death was instantaneous, Gacy said, and I wasn't altogether sad. In fact, I felt relief. No more pig slop, unbearable home life. Gacy's eyes became distant, seeing something beyond us. The light came. It was so warm, so beautiful. All my pain was gone, every bad feeling, all the horrible things done to me. Gone. Gacy snapped her fingers. Heaven, she said, is a place you never want to leave. Gacy swallowed carefully, and I had a sharp, uncomfortable pang of conscience. Had I misjudged her? Was I being cruel like the other kids had been? I thought of Nana and my father and even Vienna and an unusual family, yes, but what did I know of pig slop and a harsh family? Gacy's eyes became heavy with tears that pooled under her red eyelids. Well, if you were dead, then how did you come back? Gacy tilted her head at me. Because I realized there were people who needed me. Either Gacy was a masterful liar or she believed this story without a doubt. But what I wanted to know, how exactly does one die and come back to life? How long was she underwater? How cold was the water? How long was her body deprived of oxygen? I knew the statistics, and they were grim. What was the extent of her head injuries? How had everyone gotten out of the water but Myron? And who exactly needed her to come back? Did she mean her friends? My parents? Or someone else? I opened my mouth. That's all for tonight, she said with a decisive nod and walked to the kitchen window. The sun was setting over the cornfields, day heading into night. I sat stewing. How could she leave me hanging like that? Is Wilbur coming to dinner tonight? Micah asked, his voice like an eager puppy's. No, Wilbur is not coming to dinner. The way she said it with such finality made me sure that Gacy knew the where and the how and the why. For all her talk of no secrets, Gacy was keeping a few. She turned slowly and looked longingly at the empty dinner plate. But I had to set a place anyway, just in case. After we ate, we got on her bikes, and the sun was completely gone to sleep. Micah and Jimmy, told to accompany us home, turned on their headlamps. Gacy came out on the porch. Don't you dare talk to anyone, she yelled. You're just the sort of children the circus would love to borrow. Can you yell any louder? Jimmy yelled back at Gacy. Oh, you bet your bootstraps I can yell louder than that, she hollered, her voice echoing all the way down the street. Jimmy shook his head and led the way down Landlark Lane. It was spooky, with the sun almost down, the air cooling and becoming so dark I couldn't see the road ahead. Biddy whimpered beside me. I imagined this was the sort of night that the headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow would appear in. Come on, Biddy. We pedaled faster, but it only brought the panic closer. Control your imagination, my father would say. I suddenly thought of the creepers. Were they allowed outside after dark? The only lights were from Micah's headlamp and the few that dimly shone out of the occasional farmhouse window. I shivered, though it wasn't cold, with the feeling that someone was watching us. Corn, now tall enough to hide grown men, monsters, and ghosts, rustled on either side of the road. I wouldn't have been able to explain how or who, but I just knew. We didn't bike home alone that night. I didn't have time to think more about it, though, because when we arrived home, it was to Nana, who was annoyed we had stayed so long, annoyed we had intruded on Gacy's dinner, and annoyed we hadn't found out anything about Wilbur's absence. My father left for the care center before I could ask him anything about sledding and Gacy's version of events. It was after visiting hours, and I wish they wouldn't let him in. I wish they'd see the tired shadows under his eyes and tell him to go home and go to sleep. And part of me wished he'd just stay with us instead of always running to her. We climbed into bed, and Biddy hugged me around the waist as I began our Peter Pan story. I was barely to the lost boys when she whispered, Is Jimmy a lost boy? He has Gacy, I guess. Then Gacy's like Peter Pan, right? More like Captain Hook, I scoffed. We lay quiet in the darkness of our bedroom, looking out into the vast sky that was just outside our window. The stars were bright, the night cold. I think we both fell asleep thinking of a girl named Gacy, a lost, ugly little girl nobody loved, nobody wanted, never feeling needed. I could not imagine her ever having been small or having a mother or father, but I guess she had been a little girl once, had run around Crow, had played with my parents. She had even died, like Vienna. Wasn't it extraordinary that they had both come back to life, but with scars of different sorts?